Welcome to Cutting Down the Nets Final Four edition. There are only 3 games left in the college basketball season, and we are at our Final Four. And 3 of those teams are good, so it should be a fun weekend up ahead. Sorry, UCLA. You're just not very good. Let's dig into the results from the Elite Eight briefly. And then look, there's only a couple games, we're gonna deep dive. So this is the show for degenerates, I would say. We'll really dig into each team's profile and just spend a little bit more time talking through the games, which I always enjoy. Elite Eight. We had, oh, Patty, you beautiful human being, you. UCLA winning by zero point 0.4 points. They actually won by 2. So a spectacular performance from the computer as UCLA covers. We gave them a 69% chance of covering the +7, and they came through with an outright win. Oregon State stormed back, clawed its way into a game. We had them with a 55% chance of covering. They did close that final to 6. A note on that game, if you bet on Houston, Oregon State, the over or the under, you had a bad beat. I mean, it was insane, the final minute of that game with intentional fouls and deciding not to foul, a late 3 from Oregon State. It's just absolute grossness, which welcome to college basketball betting. Baylor got out to that early lead, which we said was a key for them outperforming their median, and Arkansas didn't quit. Give them credit. We gave Arkansas a 53% chance of covering. They did not, as they ended up falling just short, losing by 11. And then at 8.5, this Gonzaga-USC game was a toss-up at 50.5, and that game was not close. So overall for this round, our estimates above 60% were 1-0, above 55, 2-0, blah, blah, blah. Let's see how we're doing for the tournament. Overall, above 60% is now 8-9. Above 55% is hitting at about 55%, and above the VIG is hitting at about 55%. And if you did blind betting on all of the games, which I would not recommend, 50.9. So really, in my opinion, if we could have just flipped 1 or 2 of these at the top, maybe it's Virginia Tech, maybe it's LSU against Michigan, whatever it might be, a 10-7, that would have completely met my expectations and would have been a fantastic tournament. So I don't know if it's sample size. I don't know if it's all the the issues with adjusted efficiencies given the schedules and the COVID pauses I've discussed on previous shows, but real close to basically this doing exactly what I had expected. And unfortunately, when you lose at the top, you're probably not winning piles of money, that's for sure. So before I get into the games and Patty's median projection, let's dig into, this is going to feel like an infomercial for Bart Torvik, but we're going to dig into each team's profile. We'll start with the Houston-Baylor game, obviously. And if you're ever on these team pages on a game that hasn't happened yet, and you click on a projection, it will take you to a page where you can kind of match up the teams. So let's start there, and I'll tell you some risks with doing this. When you go to a matchup page, this is using seasons worth of data. I typically ignore anything that happened in November, December, and most of January. So it's not that I discount it and don't use it as much. It's like it didn't exist in my mind. So for the year, you have Houston as a top 10 offensive and defensive adjusted efficiency team. You have Baylor as a top 5 offensive and a top 40 defensive, but we'll talk about how their true number is probably much, much better than that. So looking for matchup edges, you're looking for green on one side and red on the other. So the first one we see is for the year, Houston rebounds at a 40% rate on the offensive glass, which is top 2 in the country. Baylor, not a good defensive rebounding team. So if there was to be an edge to be had, Houston on the glass. Free throw rate. Houston does get into foul situations. Now, they run pretty deep bench, especially for the bigs, but they are susceptible to fouls, which can lead to like free points, However, that's not necessarily Baylor's style. Now, in a one-game matchup, things can change for sure. Baylor, top 50 two-point shooting team. Houston, top 4 two-point shooting defense. Baylor, top 1 three-point shooting team. And Houston, top 11. Houston plays very, very slow, and Baylor is willing to oblige. From shot selection standpoint, Houston is only taking 30% of its shots close to the rim. And if you've been watching Houston games, it can be maddening at times. But most of their shots are going to be threes and long twos. So that is kind of a high variance style, but with their rebounding rate, it seems to work for them. So Baylor does get inside more, and Baylor shoots at a pretty decent clip, not quite the rate that Houston does from three-point range, but they are deadly accurate, like I said, number 1 in the nation. So that's a little bit about the matchup. Let's look at their profiles. What I'm looking at is adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency. This is not what their points per possession was for that game. Here's their offensive points per possession, defensive points per possession. The way this works is, let's go to Cleveland State. Houston scored 1.342 points per possession against Cleveland State. Cleveland State has a below average defense, so the adjusted offensive efficiency for that game was 1.278. So all of this is factored for quality of opponent, that opponent's defense, that opponent's offense, all that sort of stuff. So I consider these metrics, that's why my model's built on them, to be very fair regardless of what conference you came from, who you've played, all that sort of thing, and they just get stronger over time. So Houston offensively was a team that struggled during December. So early in the season, not much there. 105 to 115 felt like the ceiling. Now, over the next, 23 games, they've shown more consistency with offensive efficiency. So early in the season, I would say, yeah, Houston's an elite defensive team, but can't really score. They have certainly worked to improve that throughout the course of the year. And no surprise, Kelvin Sampson's a fantastic coach. They've had a couple offensive struggles in this tournament, and they could be looking at one against Baylor. That's something to consider. Defense, basically one bad game, East Carolina, and then Memphis was a little shaky. Oh, no, it was this Memphis one, 102, and that came from Memphis just shooting really, really well. So for them to meet their median outcome, you need them to basically rebound and defend. Now, you don't need to hold Baylor under a point per possession to have an adjusted efficiency in the low 90s. I mean, this is all math. So, like, if Baylor were to be at 117 or whatever, like you're going to hold them below their average, and it'd be reflected in these numbers. From a personnel standpoint, 2 shooters, Grimes and Sasser. When I see Grimes shoot, feels like he's in rhythm. He can shoot from all areas of the three-point line. He'll hit corner threes, top of the key, wing. Great shooter, 41% on the year. Sasser forces it a bit. Just seems like not as good of a decision maker on when to pull the trigger on threes, but is what it is. From the 2 points, Sasser much stronger. Grimes basically shoots at about the same clip, 2-point or 3-point, because he is shooting further from the basket typically. So Dejan Duro, lockdown defender, not as lockdown defender, or not as strong a lockdown defender as Davion Mitchell is for Baylor, but Duro certainly shut down Buddy Boeheim, and then he did fine on Ethan Thompson. They spread the ball out a little more, and it's not like a Boeheim offense. So I would put Duro on Butler. I think that will be the story, but as you'll see, Baylor has multiple shooters. So let's look at Baylor. Again, when you look at a summary of a team, this is full season. So let's dig into their game by game. You see similar offensive dips and spikes, but overall, I think a profile on offense a little stronger for Baylor than Houston. On defense, Houston had far more green here, and the reason being, starting on February 2nd after the Texas game, they went into their COVID break. Gosh, I can't wait till COVID breaks are done. And they returned to play 2, 4, 6, 7 games at a defensive rate nowhere near what that team is capable of. I've told you on previous shows, according to Scott Drew, it was lack of practices. They couldn't practice during the COVID break. And then all of a sudden they started playing games, and you see it in how they defended. Some of these teams shot 60+% from 2-point range on Baylor, where for the year, their 2-point defense is below 50. So if it was 1 or 2 games, I would have completely ignored it because it just would have been massaged out by all the other performances. But it was such a long stretch that it had me a little weak on Baylor for a while. Now, they have shown in this tournament that is fixed. So if you believe the narrative, you would use data like these 4 games and then these 15 games roughly. Anyway, I'm coming up with a defensive efficiency of 89 for Baylor, and their offensive efficiency was fairly close to Houston's from a profile standpoint. Personnel-wise, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys that can shoot the 3, all basically at 40% or higher. It's pretty good when your lockdown defender hits 45% of his threes. These guys spread it out a little bit more, so overall, I think you're seeing similar 3-point shots, but Baylor's are going to come from pretty much everyone, and Houston's are going to come from Sasser and Grimes. So dangerous team from deep, but Houston's strength is 3-point defense, 2-point defense. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Here's how Patty sees the game. Patty has Baylor by 1.6, and that is giving Baylor the 89 defensive efficiency, where its true profile is probably closer to 92, 93. But I'm bought in, and there's still a cushion there. So if you use 92 or 93, you'd have Houston winning this game. Just something to note. How Baylor can outperform their median and basically put Houston away, it's going to come down to their perimeter defense. Houston likes jumpers. Baylor just forced jumpers, and it should work. However, longer the jumper, longer the rebound. Houston just, as I say here, boards like dogs. They They tip the ball out. They're just extremely active. Baylor's strength is not on the defensive glass, but who knows what will happen in this particular matchup. Baylor certainly has the athletes and the size. I would consider they're like I don't know, kind of like Memphis, like with their bigs. Like Vital reminds me of a guy who would play for Memphis. Is just my take there. Baylor's risks are their offensive efficiency. It has popped up in a couple games and it has gone cold. And if you're going to go cold, it typically happens against teams like Houston. So we'll see how that plays out. Houston's risks, I think, are greater. Their risks are Mitchell's going to be on Grimes. And if you take away Grimes, this team really lacks avenues to score. Dejan Giroux is a complete player, excellent player, but averages like 9 points a game. Like it's not coming from there. So then you go to Sasser, and you're still going to have a great defender on Sasser, whoever ends up guarding him. So Houston's risks are offense if they aren't rebounding. If they're rebounding, they're going to be okay. So that's how I see this game kind of playing out. Overall, I will be on the Houston side. I would not rush to bet this game. I think we could touch 6 for a point spread. I don't think 6.5 is going to happen, but 6 is possible, and I'll likely settle for 5.5 shortly before tip. Game number 2. Let's dig into this juggernaut of UCLA taking on the little guy from Washington in Gonzaga. When we get to UCLA's profile, you'll see how it's kind of pointless to use their season-long data, but you do need to have it in their mind. Similar to Houston, UCLA, look at the shot share from outside, basically. 40% are long twos or longer than close, and then 3 points. So you've got another jump shooting team. They've run a little hot, but they've done it in different ways. Juzang just torched Michigan, but Juzang in the previous game against Alabama was a liability offensively. I think he was like 4 for 16 or something like that. And Hawkes came through. So they've got ways. Jules Bernard got cold, and he's a better player than that. So I don't know. We'll see how their offense performs. But I don't think that's necessarily the true key to the game, because if a team's going to shoot these long jumpers, they've done that. They've done this all year, and the results are what the results are. It's not like they recently fell in love with the jumper and it's going to burn them. This is who they are, and it's worked for them. And I think the last 2 games specifically against Bam and Michigan, they have really benefited from like 5-minute stretches where they're real hot, like real hot. Gonzaga, this is scary when you have a team as good as them. 48% of their shots are close twos, so that means 54% of their shots are like basically at the rim. Now, close twos isn't necessarily at the rim. I forget what the depth is, but I mean it's less than 10 feet. That's for sure. So high percentage shots, and they make a high percentage of them. So when you see like shooting percentages for Gonzaga, it's not shooting percentages. It's like layup percentages and like turnaround baby hooks and stuff like that. Saw a stat recently on Twitter. They've gone 54 games in a row shooting above 50% on 2-point shots, which is easy to do when you're going through the layup line in Elite 8 games against USC. Edgewise, Gonzaga just doesn't have flaws. They're at worst good at everything, and at best elite at most things. So let's dig into their profile. I've never seen a profile this consistent. So if you look at, like Bama's and stuff like that, you'll see offensive efficiencies in the like 150s, and then you'll see some in the I think they had some in the 90s, maybe even the 80s. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Like, which comes from the style of play they have. Everything comes inside, and those are high percentage shots, and they make them, and they're really good at it. But the amount of times they've been at like 130 is just, there's just not much of variance in their offense. On the defensive side of the ball, very similar story. They had one game, and it's a 115.3, and it's because they allowed 1.1 points per possession to Portland, who is the 301st ranked team in efficiency. But what happened in that game? Oh, well, they won 120 to 88. So it's like, oh yeah, remember that awful game where they won by 30 points and scored a $120? That was that game. So, God, this team's good. It's really, really good. For the tournament, again, they just stay in that window of 124 to 135. It's what they do. It's what they've done, and they're really good at it. Stylistically, the only true like shooter from the outside is Kispert. He has attempted 200 three-pointers basically this year and makes 45%, which is obscene. That is real strong. Look at their 2-point percentages. Like, no one misses. It's just insane. From a usage perspective, I mean, it's Suggs and Timmy, and then you kick to any other All-American that you'd like to. But from a usage perspective, the offense goes through those two guys. So, excellent team, zero flaws. They're just being, they're dealing with point spreads that are fair, is what's happening. So, there you have their profile. Let's dig into UCLA. Something to note. UCLA is a perfect example. Oregon State was too, but a perfect example of like, I don't care what happened in the game. All I care about is what your adjusted offensive efficiency was. So there's been a lot of talk about they lost 4 straight before the tournament. But if you look at their profile, 115 offensive, 124, 117, 114. Like, that's them. Defensive efficiency, 97, 107, 90, 98. Like, that's fine. Like, that's not, to me, coming into a tournament cold. Yeah, they had 4 losses, but I have no issues with their performance in those games. So, during the tournament, have they run a little hot? Yes. They've really stepped up defensively, and then they are grinding pace. That Alabama 79 possessions includes overtime. That was closer to a 60 possession game against freaking Alabama. So, can they keep Gonzaga under 70 possessions? I don't think anyone's been able to do that this year. So here are possessions. St. Mary's, yeah, they could do that. But look at this Virginia. They even got Virginia to 70 and then scored 100 on them. So that's going to be a key for UCLA, is somehow dragging this down to a 65 possession game, which is just probably not possible against Gonzaga. So that is a little bit about their profile. They did have a stretch in the middle of the year that, not good offensively. So that's what you have. That's UCLA. I've accounted for all of that. Look at them stylistically. Juzang's their shooter, but they have guys capable of pulling the trigger. This is not an offense that only goes through one person, but you would not know that looking at the Michigan game where they rode the hot hand of Johnny Juzang. So Hawkes is capable. Tiger Campbell, good point guard. This is a team that is capable, and I'll get to what capable means in a little bit. So right now, UCLA is ranked 20th in Bart Torvik. Look, Gonzaga's been steamrolling everyone, but these things happen. Like, I don't know. BYU is a similar profile team. Gonzaga by 10. I don't know, St. Mary's 14, 18 to Pacific. It's a fair number, but I do feel it's a little inflated. So let's dig in. Let's get to that game. Oh, Patty, don't let me down. Patty has this as an 11-point game against Gonzaga. So UCLA staying within 11 against the Bulldogs. So money line of minus 1100. I'm giving them a 74% chance of winning. That is not a good bet. I don't know. If a team has a 25, 26% chance of winning, is that ever a good bet? Long term, yes, but single sample, not, and probably not the spot to pick UCLA to win the game. Cover perspective. If you are betting UCLA, I would bet this as late as possible. If you are betting Gonzaga, I would bet that immediately at 14 if you're taking that side. I'm not. I'll be on UCLA. I'm going to ride. How can Gonzaga outperform their median? They need to continue to bait UCLA into taking the jumpers. Again, that's not new for UCLA. Same story with Houston and Baylor. These teams like to do that, and it can burn you, but that's how they've lived. That's what they've done, and it's how they roll. I don't think there's risks on Gonzaga's side. It's going to come down to whether or not UCLA makes shots. I mean, it's pretty easy at that point. So how can UCLA outperform this median? It absolute transition D. I never thought they'd be able to slow Alabama down as much as they did from a pace standpoint. It will be a challenge versus Gonzaga. I'm sure it's the focus of their entire prep is to somehow make this game slow. Gonzaga got up and down against USC, and it was just layups after layups. So, risk, the jumper luck runs out. It can happen. So, what I've done to account for this, I have 115 offensive efficiency for UCLA, where I believe their true median is closer to 118, 119. I'm bringing it down a little as that 118, 119 is from, quote unquote, running hot. But if you look at how UCLA performed in the mid range to 3-point range, like against Michigan and Alabama, they didn't shoot that well. I mean, it was like 33%. Like it was average. So how they performed to me was not outliers against those teams. They performed to expectation. The difference in the Bama game was Bama like not making free throws, and that game should have been probably like a, I don't know, 3, 4, 5-point game if it was played true, and UCLA happened to win. But that was not because UCLA ran hot. That was 100% on the Alabama side. So that's how I see it. We are going with underdogs again. I would bet both these games as late as possible if you are going to do the same. And I look forward to closing out the year on a nice little hot streak. The final episode before the championship game will be who's cutting down the nets. That's kind of fun. And then I will do a futures show. And futures are tricky. I would recommend betting in like April of this year, potentially. And then maybe November. And then like typically not after that unless something's gone really weird. So we'll go into way more detail on future betting and how to handle futures and if it's worth tying up your money for long periods of time. So thank you for stopping by, cutting down the nets. Good luck in the Final Four.